Ann Welch was Jessie Crookston's grandmother. This is a story about Ann Welch, her mother Elizabeth, and her brother John. Ann Welch tells the story.
My father was a devout Methodist, a local preacher, and Sunday school teacher. I was the only living daughter, and my father seemed very fond of me. Very often he would take me on long walks to visit the sick and poor. My father and Uncle William were brownware potters by trade. Welch's pottery was situated on Brampton Moor near Chesterfield. My mother was a lace worker before her marriage to father, after which she became agent for Mr. Fisher of Nottingham. The lace was embroidered on fine bobbin net in pieces of about 30 yards in length and 3/4 of a yard wide for ladies' dresses. She used to go up to Chesterfield and get materials and patterns. She would then let it out to ladies and girls in our neighborhood and superintend the work. When it was done, she delivered it at Chesterfield and paid off the hands. She sometimes made beautiful fine black lace veils. She continued to be agent until 1842. Our home was situated in Beaver Street. This property was bequeathed to my father, Nicholas Welch, by his father, Nicholas Welch. It was a 4-roomed cottage which fronted to the east. I remember that we had some beautiful pieces of mahogany furniture which my mother used to keep polished up with beeswax and turpentine. I also remember that above the settee or lounge in the living room hung a large, beautiful picture of Goldsmith's deserted village. We also had a number of brass candlesticks and irons and other things. One evening in the fall of 1841, as mother was returning home after having delivered some of her lace at Chesterfield, she noticed a crowd of people on a street corner, and being curious as to what was going on, drew nearer. She saw what looked to her like a mere boy standing on a box talking to the crowd. As she drew nearer, she found to her surprise that he was preaching. Mother was not religiously inclined, even though my father was a Methodist preacher. She never gave serious thought to his work. On this occasion she was curious and then interested and stopped to listen. Although he was small of stature and looked very young, he was about 22 years of age. His name was Alfred Corden, a local elder of Stratfordshire. The things she heard impressed her deeply, and after the meeting she stepped up and shook hands with the young man, asked his name and where he was from. She then told him her name and where she lived and invited him to her home to meet her husband and family and tell them about the gospel. It was about a mile to her home. When she reached home, the family were all there except the eldest son, Jack, who was at Sheffield serving on an apprenticeship at a cutlery trade. Mother walked in and set the basket down on the table, and addressing father said, "Nick, I've heard the gospel." He looked at her in surprise and said, "Oh, you have? That's funny for you." She said, "Yes, I have heard the gospel, and it's the only gospel, and it's true, and I know it, and I've invited this young elder to visit and to tell us more about it." Elder Corden did come and teach them further concerning the truth, and they were baptized and made members of the church soon after. In the spring of 1842, our little family left our comfortable home, with the exception of John, who still had some time to serve at his trade with the George Worstenholme and Sons, which is still in the cutlery business in Sheffield. We sailed from Liverpool in the ship Hope of Barra Dock. We were 8 weeks on board and came by way of New Orleans. We arrived at Nauvoo in the summer of 1842 and located with the Saints. The house my father was able to get for us was a very poor one. It was very hard to accustom ourselves to conditions after having been used to a comfortable home in England. Father could only get work in an adobe yard. The work was too hard for him, and his feet were swelled all day. He took a severe cold, and the swampy location and everything seemed to be conspired against him. It was a sad experience for us all. The house leaked, and then my little brothers took sick. They all 3 were down at once. It was November, the latter part in the year 1842, when my dear father died. Inside of 2 weeks, they all 3 had passed to the great beyond. Mother and I were left all alone in that hovel on the Mississippi shore. Our neighbors did all they could to help us, but so many of them were all also in trouble with sickness, poverty, and death that it was and has always been to me a dreaded thing to remember. Brother Hiram Smith heard about us, and to save our lives he sent his team and some help, and they moved us to a little house on his own farm in the upland, where we were more comfortable. We were all alone, and our neighbors were quite a distance away. About a mile, I judge it, was to the business part of town. I could get nothing worthwhile to do at that time. I was only about 15, and to get things we needed, Mother would send me to town with something of our belongings to sell or trade for a few provisions. One day, while on my way to sell our silver teaspoons, I met a gentleman. I think he must have known who I was. He stopped and asked me how I was and how was Mother. I told him that, then asked him if he would not like to buy the spoons, showing them to him. He took from his pocket $1 and pressed it into my hand, and patting me on the shoulder said, "You go and get something with that, my girl, and take the spoons home to your mother." I found later that he was Joseph Young, brother of Brigham Young. We were very lonely, and I missed my brothers and fathers very much. My father was always loving and kind. Brother Will was such a dear, good boy, and our baby brother Georgie, I felt the world was a dreary place for me. Mother and I had a hard time getting along and were glad to do anything that we could get to do. A good friend of ours, Brother George Grant, told us that he had some friends in Chicago who wanted a girl to help with the housework. So my mother consented for me to go with him to a Mr. Hogan's family. Brother Grant took me with him in a buggy and drove to Chicago. The Hogans were very nice people and treated me almost as one of their own. I lived with them for quite a while, a year or more. Mrs. Hogan was a delicate woman and appreciated my help. I went to see my mother after I had been away several months, and I was sorrowful that my mother had remarried. The man's name was Robert Madison. He was a bachelor and was comparatively comfortable and could take care of Mother, and she had been advised to marry him. My mother said that he was very good to her and tried to make her feel at home. I could not bear to have anyone take my father's place, and I wanted to go back to Chicago. The Hogans had moved away, but I was acquainted pretty well with other people, so I went back and got a place with the family by the name of Claiborne. They had a large place not far from Lake Michigan in the suburbs. He was in the meat market business and had 7 meat markets in Chicago City. They were very good to me, although there was a lot of work. I stayed with them until my brother John had emigrated and had been in Nauvoo a good time. In the meantime, my mother was a widow again. Mr. Madison had taken a fever that was so prevalent there and had died. He was a very good man and very good to Mother. At that time, my brother John Welch came in a buggy to Chicago to take me back to Nauvoo, Illinois.
John tells the story from his perspective. In the spring of 1842, my parents, my sister, Anne, and my brothers, William and George, sailed for America. I remained with the Worston Homes to complete my apprenticeship. I had learned the skills of cutlery making very thoroughly, so the year plus the few months left of my apprenticeship was the period when my work would have been of the greatest worth to the Worston Homes. In the summer or fall of 1842, I began having a nightly dream in which my father stood looking at me with a troubled expression, and I felt that my family must be having some kind of difficulty. George Worstonholme had always said that if for any reason any of his apprentices grew dissatisfied enough to run away, he would resort to the law to force the young fellow to return. I decided to slip away and go to Nauvoo to assist my family. During the night, while the other boys slept, I got my belongings together and left by a dormitory window. I sped away to join the Mormon missionaries who were sailing for America. In first seeing the prophet Joseph Smith, I did not see how anyone could fail to realize that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. On arrival in Nauvoo, I learned that my father and 2 brothers had died, leaving my mother and sister Anne living in privation. I learned that they had been under the necessity of selling keepsakes, accepting charity and taking whatever work they could get, doing fine sewing and housework. Following the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith, I realized that a call for the entire body of Latter-day Saints to begin moving out of Nauvoo was very likely. I wanted Anne and my mother to be with me, should the time for departure arise suddenly, so I went to Chicago by horse and buggy to bring Anne home.